Lou is a Two-Spirit Navajo scholar and writer born in Arizona and living in Brooklyn. They are a PhD student of smutty sci-fi at the CUNY Graduate Center, a senior editor of The New Inquiry, and a member of the editorial collective For Lies, a journal of materialist feminism. And I'm so happy to have gotten to help give this essay a home. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And thank you so much, Ingrid, for giving this essay home. A bit of the backstory was that I wrote a more sort of like straightforward rendition of this essay, and it went through one round of edits at a long-time popular leftist publication that will not be named, and they eventually rejected it because they said that they were a little put off by my, quote, total rejection of borders. So I was happy to find somebody who was a little bit more willing to hear that critique of nationalism that I think is important to any discussion of nuclear arms, atomic energy, et cetera, et cetera. So as much as I'm tempted to read it from its form in this giant like pull-out newspaper poster, I'm going to go the more dirtbag millennial route and read it from my phone. But please, please do grab a copy. And from what I hear, there's quite a few because of how newspaper printing works. We had to print quite a large number. So feel free to take more than one and maybe use them as a poster somewhere. That would be awesome. And it starts with two epigraphs. The first from Leslie Marmon Silko's novel Ceremony. Up here in these hills, they will find the rocks with veins of green and yellow and black. They will lay the final pattern with these rocks. They will lay it across the world and explode everything. The second epigraph comes from W.B. Du Bois. If power can be held through atomic bombs, colonial peoples may never be free. In 1998, a group of Dene elders from Northwest Canada traveled to Hiroshima to meet with survivors and descendants of survivors of the atomic bomb dropped some 50 years earlier. Some of the uranium used to kill more than 200,000 people in Japan had been mined and transported by Dene men, many of whom died years later from radiation-related disease. The 6 Dene elders came from where the earth had been torn up to the place where earth and sky were ripped apart like never before. They came to Hiroshima to apologize and to recognize the shared radioactive reality between people touched by the detonation of the bomb and those who unwittingly touched the materials that would make such a weapon. Nobody from the Canadian government was present. None among those who had exploited the miners' bodies in their homelands and willingly aided the construction of the atomic bomb ever made the journey. The reinscribed path of the Dene elders' trip illuminated the radiated lines connecting settler colonial resource extraction and Western imperial war making. And some of the maps that you'll be seeing, which are from here, were also made by Ingrid, and I'm very grateful for that. One of them shows the trajectory of the Hiroshima elders' trip. Theirs was an act of unexpected mapping, connecting two nodes of a much larger and largely obscured sphere of ongoing and purposefully scattered atomic apocalypse. What does it mean to ask forgiveness for something you had no choice in doing? Those whose lives are crossed by uranium and other radioactive weapons materials form a diffuse collective of families, communities, enemies, and strangers. They are the irradiated international, and in their glowing, death-laced tales, there is another invisible world emerging, one paradoxically born of destruction and staged to destroy the destroyers. Very few people seem to know about this trip. Very few people seem to know that Canada is the world's second largest producer of uranium. Very few people seem to know how intimately connected Canada was to the massacre in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Before the bomb, there were internment camps in Canada, much like those in the United States, where people of Japanese heritage were sent during World War II. Their mirror is found in the immigration detention centers and their echo in the First Nations reserves of today. The very few people who do not know some of these things may be the amorphous, fluid we who know some of the rest. Where one violence occurs, the smoke caused obscures another somewhere else. Bombs, borders, the border as a bomb dropped into people's lives, and all the deadly effects lingering. Canada is so shameless as to have named a place Port Radium in 1937. The name remains, as does the legacy of radiation. The half-life of uranium-235 used in the atomic bomb dropped on the people of Hiroshima and perversely named Little Boy is 703,800,000 years. The halved life of a uranium miner is so exponentially smaller, my small mind can't calculate the proportion. Half-lives and less are doled out to Indians killed, if not by poison, then some other obscured condition of fatality. More than 100,000 people's lives cut down in half a second in Hiroshima. The route where uranium flowed from the mines near Port Radium to where it would be shipped for use in the Manhattan Project was called the Highway of the Atom. In Canada today, there's another stretch of road called the Highway of Tears, known for the high number of First Nations women who have disappeared en route to elsewhere. This is the movable feast of unending wars. In 1998, the Dene Uranium Committee published a report called They Never Told Us These Things. Among these untold things was the protracted harms of working in the uranium mines and the atomic bomb, working in the uranium mines and the atomic bomb that would result from such work. When the Dene learned about their particularly poisoned place in a global design, they sought out connection with the ruptured Irradiated International. They traveled to Hiroshima, unable to do the bomb, but willing to witness its rout. As Anthony Burke describes it, they, quote, wanted to draw a cosmic circle between the events and connect two communities in a shared discourse of mourning and experience. The circle is broken all over, and the constructed impossibility of seeing what has tied together and unbound those caught in the routes of uranium. There are unmarked highways of the other than human as well. Movements marked by radiation cuts across life forms. You've maybe heard of the wolves taking back Chernobyl. The reindeer from the area have taken their trace contamination as far north as Norway. The species-related herds of caribou in Canada are similarly contaminated, having drank from the irradiated tailings left by and leaching into Great Bear Lake by Port Radium. In her play that in part describes the entangled lives of Hiroshima atomic bomb victims, Dene miners, and other beings of the Irradiated International, Métis playwright Marie Clements includes the stage directions for a world many know but others cannot see. And this is the image that inspired a lot of this work, actually. Glowing herds of caribou move in unison over the vast, empty landscape as cherry blossoms fall until they fill the stage. This is the wasted land, both emptied and filled, alight with slow death and even more persistent life. Tracing the hoof prints of glowing caribou and the worn tracks of uranium routes are the lit-up bodies of Indians that the extractors could never really kill. The Irradiated International calls to us through the broken-down walls of the world, rays shooting from our eyes, out of our fingertips and toes. We inhaled, ingested, inherited radioactive material that will never die. Rendered invisible, not unlike the invasive waves of radiation itself, we constitute a global force, potential vector lines against the routes of commodity speculation and transport. Thousands of miles south of Deline, the town where the Dene elders traveled from, and across the United States border, is Dene Bekeya, the ancestral lands of the Navajo, and the smaller enclosed lands of the Navajo Reservation. The Dene are distant relatives of the Dene, their resonant tribal names revealing a common language group, Athabascan. Though the Dene migrated south, they would not escape extractive industries and military men looking for the world-ending power stored in the yellow uranium ore in the earth. There are currently 350 nuclear waste sites from abandoned uranium mines dotting this land with poison. United States President Donald Trump and Secretary of the Interior Ryan Zinke would like to reopen the mines around the Grand Canyon, in addition to the private leasing for mineral and oil rights throughout the Southwest. Simultaneously, the administration moves to classify Indians as a special interest group, understood as a racial category that therefore must, like all others, assign this particular inclusive other status, meet certain work requirements to receive Medicaid. The attempts to classify away the colonial relationship only makes it starker. The only jobs that then might be available in order to qualify for health care would be jobs in the mines. In this future, Navajo people work for Medicaid because the work ensures they will need the health insurance, if it's even enough. Navajo men were compelled to work the former uranium mines from the 1930s through the 1960s, a period directly following the Bureau of Indian Affairs' concerted campaign to reduce livestock on the Navajo reservation. This immense loss, the severing of social and material relations around sheep herding, preempted the entry of Navajos into the wage economy. Working in the uranium mines meant new kinds of disease. The Navajo word for cancer is ludu nadasili, which translate approximately the sore that does not heal. Sores proliferate the histories of uranium and Indians. Inside the molecules of Navajo people's bodies, even those who never worked or lived near the mine, there are also traces of the Rio Puerco disaster. In 1979, the United Nuclear Corporation's Mill Tailings Pond Dam broke, releasing 95 million gallons of radiated water into a tributary of the main source of agricultural irrigation and drinking water for many Dene on the reservation and surrounding towns. Rio Puerco was also where children and others might splash around, but following the spill, the waters caused burns on the feet of any waders. The contaminants also reached nearby aquifers and spilled over into riverside pools. The enormity of this nuclear disaster is outmatched only by the Chernobyl disaster of 1986. Yet Rio Puerco remains unheard of, largely unheard of, outside New Mexico. My Navajo family comes from the area around Rio Puerco. I think with the Irradiated International to push myself beyond my circumscribed homes. The paradox of being Navajo means being both within and without and outside the nation. Most Americans don't know about Rio Puerco because the reservation in Dene Bekeya is purposefully kept foreign while simultaneously under domestic control. Indigeneity is often marked by proximity to land that is simultaneously valued and denigrated by the colonists. While indigenous peoples conceive of their place in the world according to various cosmological, political, and social philosophies, in the colonist view, to be indigenous is to be either dead or in the way. The closer the Indian to the resources and the longer they have lived there, the less their lives seem worthy. A reverse proportion to how badly the material is needed. The boom and bust model of mining means that while mining corporations might shut down or depart from an area, the material they left behind may not begin to show instances of bodily harm for another decade or two. The mines and the people are abandoned but not alone. Radiation is forever. Radiation wants a home too. It grows one inside the people's bodies. Before the mining, wherever it has occurred on the globe, most uranium stayed snugly embedded among the rocks. Forced up from its resting place and leached to make weapons-grade material or the falsely benevolent source of energy, its excess does not settle back nicely. Now it is like shrapnel. A group called Dene No Nukes has drawn similar connections to the atomic legacy in Japan as the Dene did back in the 90s. A sticker distributed by the group to raise awareness and funds for their projects features a trilingual declarative against nuclear power in English, Japanese, and Dene Bazad, the Navajo language. In 2014, the group started the Radiation Monitoring Project, a community program of workshops inspired by Japanese activists who, in the wake of the Fukushima nuclear plant catastrophe, acquired the tools to autonomously monitor radiation levels when they could not trust the government to do so truthfully. Similar mistrust is familiar to many uranium communities who have tried to receive compensation for health effects the government claims cannot be casually linked to uranium poisoning. The Radiation Exposure Compensation Act is one of the few government actions that address or redress harms from nuclear testing and uranium mining, granting useless apologies and amounts of money that cannot undo an apocalypse that leaches and spreads across generations. In the prioritizing of nuclear energy, whether for destructive bombs or supposedly clean energy, governments are also quick to rescind notions of humanity and citizenship. According to Japanese activist Mari Matsumoto, following the Fukushima disaster, many people living near the plant were forced or later chose to migrate and are now treated like illegal immigrants in the country of their birth and unable to access necessary services. The Irradiated International is one of the many collectives whose citizenship is made contingent in the overbordered world. People are being stripped of homes, which will be destroyed or deformed in their absence, either by the regulation of borders, ongoing climate catastrophe, or most likely both. Migrant and climate crises are described as the twinned engines of suffering, driving the present as it is invaded on both ends by bloody pasts and desperate futures. This is how the world ends when it is divided up into nations. Sylvia Wynter, who theorizes the possibilities for an alternative humanism in the post-atomic age, cites biologist Lewis Thomas for his remarks that nationalism, as it now proliferates, is the leading lethal agent on Earth. This articulation from a practitioner of the so-called hard sciences speaks to Wynter's project that to live in a future for the human species means a new form of unbordered knowledge. The borders of nations and the borders of thought and feeling they enforce operate under orders of strict containment. We all perhaps have something to learn from radiation about being uncontainable. The watery walls of an always growing oceanic mass grave rise as countries construct their metal walls in last-ditch attempts at nation-state sovereignty. More and more people are and will be further displaced. In the Bikini Atoll, where people were sent away from their homes so it could be bombed to hell during atomic testing, the land itself is now sinking below a rising sea. Other atomic lands are being reclaimed for purposes of space travel. Technocrats, like the predatory birds of real estate, look for the sacrifice zones where their portfolios can be expanded with the talk of expanding humanity, always, of course, indexed as a specific class of humans, to a multiplanetary or post-land existence. In French Polynesia, the Seasteading Institute is accumulating capital to construct new islands that will be designated special economic zones, what they unironically call the next new world. Next to the Mescalero Apache Reservation, next to the White Sands Missile Range and Trinity Test Site, where the first nuclear device was detonated, there is now the hulking project Spaceport USA, where supposedly the starbound destiny of commerce is being sown. All these projects speak from and invoke frontiers, unknowing or uncaring that these projects, like all frontiers, thrive on land cleared by force. To call it climate change almost sounds banal compared to the long culminating catastrophe it heralds. But these are the phrases we turn to, overwhelmed by complex chains of related phenomena on micro to macro scales across ecosystems. How else to communicate the time it takes to engineer and reverse change to these environments? The irradiated international prompt consciousness to understand the scales of the planetary and deeply historical, as well as emotional scales of having your world end, often over and over again. Her whole life, my cousin was told she could not have children because of the uranium. My whole life, I wondered if I had been born weird, incomplete, because of the uranium. My cousin did unexpectedly have a child, and like me, her daughter had what the doctors call complications. Like me, her infant heart was operated on, made cyborg so she could live. She is named for the night sky lights made by solar winds in the magnetosphere. One of the conditions of living after and because of colonialism is never knowing. We'll never know why our bodies turned out this way, if it's because of the uranium or some other invisible mutation. We've known for a while the mess of claiming mutants as stand-ins for subjects of racial violence. Others have claimed the mutant for queerness. The babies born dead on Marshall Islands did not see themselves as mutants because they never got to see it all. Their mothers probably would want to see them as children. But if it is man who has made nukes possible, what might the mutant do? The moves to make genocide invisible where I am from are also what render possible the endless war of other people's homes overseas. While some of the uranium that was used on the Japanese came from Canada, as the Dene learned, a significant amount also came from mines in the Congo. Africa continues to be a continent, as some say, quote, rich in uranium. However, the proceeds go mostly to large corporations based in other continents. Niger, Namibia, and South Africa have continued to produce thousands of tons of uranium, ranking in the 10 nations with the highest recoverable uranium resources. 600 radioactively contaminated gold mine sites, from which uranium was mined as a byproduct, remain in the proximity of Johannesburg. In Niger, a former French colony, the government has begun to allow mining companies from India and Russia to expand their uranium industries, while the nomadic Tuareg community fights for transparency about environmental risks and a share of the immense revenues. In the 1960s and 70s, African American revolutionaries developed networks of anti-colonial and anti-racist organizing that emerged from a socialist internationalism that informs my visions of the irradiated international. Bayard Rustin, the civil rights leader known for his work with the March on Washington, was an integral part of an earlier campaign protesting the French government's intention to detonate an atomic weapon in the Sahara Desert in the summer of 1959. The French have also tested nuclear bombs in the South Pacific, leading to infamous cases throughout Polynesia of radiation sickness and genetic deformities in newborn children for generations after. Rustin's work with the Sahara Campaign was an important kind of cross-historical and transnational effort to link decolonial efforts in Africa with protests for Black liberation in the United States. These efforts were united in a fight against global anti-Black racism, but also a fight for a world not dominated by those who want power through lethal control. This was a time that seems so far away from me now, the time of an anti-war movement in the United States that saw intertwined possibilities of life and liberation across swaths of sea and land. The now familiar panic of a nuclear-themed push notification creeps along my skin too, but there's something off in the hysteria that accompanies any nuke news compared to the decades the US has spent sowing apocalyptic destruction with no need for further use of A-bombs. The violence of the bombs itself is not contained to the flash of a single event. I was barely what is considered a politically conscious figure when the United States invaded Iraq. Sometimes I feel something like crazy when I realize how little we talk about it now. The invasion of Iraq was also a story of uranium. In 2001 and 2002, the Italian military intelligence agency conveyed reports and information claiming Saddam Hussein was looking to buy 500 pounds of uranium yellowcake from Niger. The documents that supposedly proved these attempted transactions of A-bomb materials were later proven to be forgeries. Days later, the United States invaded Iraq. The weapon of mass destruction is the nation. The United States of America, for one, but also the very notion of a nation itself. Kazakhstan, Canada, Australia, Niger, Russia, Namibia, Uzbekistan, China, the United States. These are the nations mining the most uranium, all connected by histories of competing empires and lines of radioactive commerce. Where can you imagine pain? Where can you register it? Where can you see violation? What lines demarcate your concern? What happens when people across great swaths of time and space witness, if not together, then in tandem? I will myself to radiate outwards, to exceed the constraint of a national body, of a closed border body, to meld with a mutant consciousness and deform what deforms me. The work to do. Making visible, making felt, making it stop. I don't yet know the chain reaction that links these acts. There is no reversal reaction to take away the death and slow death already enacted by leaky West sites and test site winds. The irradiated international are here, everywhere, and the nodes and lines linking this uncollected collective is the invisible power of radiation itself, radiation made otherwise. In their poem, Infected Sunset, Demian Dene Yazi writes from Navajo lands, I talk to the uranium beneath my body. It tells me it is lonesome. It is warm-blooded and resilient. It is angry and it has been violated. And in this way, it is just as angry as an Indian. How do you journey to the uranium and ask it for forgiveness? There is no way to undo the violation, but perhaps there are shared trajectories for our anger. There must be a way to think about earth and land and being that would make the idea of nuclear weapons impossible, and to think of the waters as well. Soon the extractors plan to plumb the ocean for their deadly matters. 4 billion tons of uranium is in the seas. It does not ask to be made solid. Fred Moten, who grew up in Las Vegas near the Nevada test site and recalls the charged air after a nuclear detonation, wonders and asks us to wonder, what complex disarticulations and rearticulations of space and subjectivity are possible and create possibility beyond the spatial obsessions of empire. I ask these questions in the form of how to claim land without slipping into property and borders, so that the irradiated international can protect themselves from harm without reproducing harm for others. I turn to a rearticulation of the invisible lines of radiation that demarcated a vast network, but one perhaps of transformed suffering. How might we take back the world and hold it differently? Revolutionary subjects, the potential of the irradiated international, are containers of energy. Decolonization is a reorganization of matter. A new geography is coming, cut by empire's geometry, but now shaped into something else. In the French Caribbean, one of the central laboratories of modern death, speaking from where the land meets the sea in Martinique, Edouard Glissant writes in the Poetics of Relation about two kinds of science, or more precisely, two directions for science to take. There is the arrow-like science of discovery as conquest, what we might call empire science, after the empirical, what can be seen. Radiation, and by extension, the irradiated international, is, you recall, invisible, until it is not. The arrow-like science is the penetrating practice that says it is neutral good to dig up radioactive materials and see how much they can annihilate. The science of observation. And in the notebook where those observations are recorded, say in the Bikini Atoll, there is no note for the people relocated to another island while the test is conducted and ferried back to a home that is no longer home. The other direction, however, Glissant describes is a science of inquiry. Rather than an arrow, the science takes the circular shape of wholeness. The science of inquiry is experimental, processive, meditative. This is the science that might note and record, as indigenous peoples globally have done, the presence of the radiated yellow dirt, but shows a different relationship to this substance than one of extraction. At the end of this section on science, Glissant states, quote, "The highest point of knowledge is poetics." How do we share knowledge with each other and to what ends? This is about a science fit to the measure of a world we want, one we can actually live more than a half-life in. Deleuze and Guattari call something similar by the name of nomadic science, a practice of seeking wonders and posing problems outside the science of the state, outside the science of sovereign categories. Britt Russert reformulates this as fugitive science, forms of apprehension that operate on lines of flight carried out by Black and Native practitioners to understand their place in future in the world outside the distorted view of empiricism. These other practices of science help me think what so far has been sputtering or overindulgent attempts to consider categories of nature, the social, the political, and the human altogether. Winter also reiterates Césaire's conception of a science of the word, a science of human systems. There are the tribal ways of knowing diffuse and different across all continents, systems of observation and the practice of being with the non-human that do not speak the name of science, but perhaps as stories or ceremonies or a blockade or an encampment against extraction. All these alternative and speculative traditions of science that have not yet been, but have always been, are a study of how and why certain beings and forms can live together, which formations create life, which conditions make more combinations of more life possible. These projects speak with the irradiated international against a science that studies how to kill, how to hoard, and how to manage such that others live longer only to die more alone. All these forms of knowing are forms of becoming. They speak the poetics of an exuberant proliferation of experience that insists on internal inquiry and constant creation. The irradiated international goes beyond what anthropologist Barbara Rose Johnson calls the radiogenic communities. It goes beyond solidarity. We must think outside the community, outside the limits of what you can care for. Imagine a solidarity that doesn't have to be solid, but diffuse, as widespread, as impersonal, as violence, as radiation. Because it does not seem that seeing the world in its entirety has done much to mitigate the violence. What does it take to feel the world in its entirety? Or is this not the answer at all? To act not just through connections, but across breaks. and the future for those whose future was taken away. I seek a materialism without teleology, a materialism of matters unseen and chaotic. More than one Southwest tribe, including the Navajo, had prophecies about the yellow strains in the rock, the ore that never had to be a weapon, but that the seers knew would be dug up and laid in lethal planetary designs. Now it is the irradiated international whose power I prophesize and who I ask to prophesize with me. A world reorganized and the practices and poetics to live with it. Thank you.
Thank you. There was a moment last evening where it was like, I might not read the whole thing, and I'm so glad you did. Thank you. Our next speaker is Darshana Jayemanne. Did I get it right? Yes. Okay. Who is the author of Performativity in Art, Literature, and Video Games, and a co-investigator in the AHRC. Is that like a thing that I should know?
No.
Okay. In a set of acronyms that support things, supported Reality Remix project on the next generation of immersive experiences. Are there any other details in here you want me to add? Okay, great. Thanks, Darshana.
So thanks for having me, especially after all these amazing talks. I'm keenly aware of the glorious American tradition of oratory, whereas in Australia we just kind of like mumble at each other. So I'm going to try to like sort of enunciate as clearly as possible. And you know, lower the tone. We're talking about video games. So and this question about like where are all the cli-fi games, which is written by, I should mention this definitely. It's based on a paper I wrote with Ben Abraham, who's at University of Technology in Sydney. So video games interactivity is supposed to make them very powerful teaching tools. Games are capable of teaching not just subject matter, but also systems thinking. That's a buzzword. As a result, we might think that they are very well suited to teaching about the complex phenomena such as climate change. However, a close look at the mainstream game industry reveals surprisingly few engagements with this theme, a lack we can compare with film, television, and as we'll do here, literature. In 2013, American public broadcaster NPR ran a story titled, "So Hot Right Now, Has Climate Change Created a New Literary Genre?" The report discussed the emergence of a genre in contemporary literature which eschews the far-flung scenarios of much science fiction in favour of the all-too-real experiences of an already changing climate. The genre begins to bring an everyday experiential dimension to the mounting evidence that we are living in a changed climate, and mirrors developments in both climate journalism and the field of climate communication, which with the help of maturing climate science itself, is more and more frequently able to attribute extreme weather events today to the emissions of the past. And that's the paper there, if you want to read more. So climate fiction, NPR's story argues, is integral to this work, leading with the example of Nathaniel Rich's Odds Against Tomorrow, which features an image of a drowned Manhattan on the cover and the climate consequences as an essential narrative focus of the novel. In a case of life imitating art, early releases of the book began arriving only days after Hurricane Sandy hit Manhattan. Speaking with scholars and novelists about the emergence of this new genre, dubbed cli-fi, the report concludes that while sci-fi usually takes place in a far dystopian future, cli-fi happens in a dystopian present. The academics and authors featured in the NPR story all focus on a critical element of the problem facing climate change activists, the significant remaining resistance to the acceptance that climate change is occurring. Climate fiction is supposed to intervene in cultural and discursive constructions of climate, as well as a host of related environmental issues, far more so than a technocratic facts and figures approach to the issue would be able to manage. Deborah Jordan's study of Australian cli-fi makes several salient contributions to our understanding of the role the literary genre is beginning to play in responding to the climate crisis in a diversified way. She argues that science and technology have monopolised the discourse around climate change, which has been kept, and there's a quote, in the technological sphere, a problem for science and policymakers, missing is the human connection, end quote. She critiques the deeply flawed nature-culture split to explain why climate change as nature, not culture, is still largely perceived as a problem for the sciences alongside planning, policy, and geography, and not the arts. Climate fiction is poised to intervene in cultural and discursive constructions of climate, as well as a host of related issues. So in her work, Jordan collates a list of dozens of recent historical Australian literary works, as well as historical ones, that speak to the current climate crisis in one way or another, from George Turner's 1987 The Sea and Summer to more contemporary works like Alexis Wright's 2006 novel Carpentaria. In an important move that informs the current paper's approach, she then expands her reading list beyond explicit engagements with climate change to encompass a broader range of ecologically sensitised work, summarising their contributions and perspectives, thereby unearthing a history of climate and environment engagement within Australian literary arts. A growing body of research now supports the view that climate change is much more complicated than an approach that simply presenting the facts approach admits, and involves ideological and other intractable resistances that are not able to be simply won over by factual persuasion. The question for digital games in this context becomes rather clearer. Are digital games doing, or could they be doing, anything similar to what cli-fi does in a literary context to contribute to our response to the ongoing climate crisis? What could artists working with digital games, as well as the mainstream games industry itself, be doing to encourage what Jordan calls an ecocentric perspective? How might games contribute, or already be contributing, to developing ecological awareness that, quote, recognises our interdependence with the non-human world, end quote? Where, in other words, are the cli-fi games? The extent of existing work is largely restricted to so-called edutainment games, like NASA's Climate Kids series, which lack the kind of incredible ability to command popular enthusiasms of digital games, to say the least. Within the majority of commercial games, whether mainstream or independently developed, we find only a few examples of thematic or topical reference to climate change. We'll come back to these later. This state of affairs mirrors the results of Jordan's study, which turns up only a dozen or so examples of explicit cli-fi works in Australian literature. However, central to her thesis is that when one expands and broadens the definition of climate change novels to also include the causes of climate change, industrialisation, colonisation, and so on, we get a much expanded picture. Following Jordan's gesture and acknowledging the relative paucity of video game examples of climate change engagements, we expand our focus to environmental or ecological representations in games more generally, principally focusing on representations of and conceptualizations of human environmental relationships. This wider view reveals a similarly richer history. In some way, games always establish some kind of relation to an outward bound or an environment, because they have to be situated in some kind of way. So just like a football field is kind of like, and scholars have talked about this as the so-called magic circle of play. So it's something that occurs on a football field means something different to something, to the same thing occurring outside of that football field. So here we need to state a few quick words about the scope of the presentation. To some degree, we're focusing on thematics, gameplay design, narrative, and other elements that are usually considered internal to criticising digital games as texts. We're also focusing on the mainstream industry rather than independent production, so that would be quite a different kind of discussion. And modding, so when people mod these games or modify these games themselves. And we're bracketing out issues of the culture and political economy of games, although to the degree that you can do that. And this can be really, really complex. Take, for example, the recent spike in the prices of high-end graphics cards that occurred because so many of these cards were being bought to mine cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin. So the prices went up, which meant that these cards were no longer available to create the virtual worlds for which they had been designed to be created, and they were instead creating virtual currency, whatever that means. And the energy use of this activity is so high that it may actually have climate impacts itself in an actual sense. So riddle me that, like this kind of, that's how like, and you know, there's all issues such as e-waste, coltan mining, other environmental impacts that arise from this industry. So Ben's working on a manuscript for a book that will investigate these in more detail. As both myself and my author are Australian, a quick example from that region might be a good way into some of the broader issues. So here we have a still from the 4X game Civilization 6. The 4Xs here do not refer to 4X beer, our beloved alcohol at export. Instead, they refer to explore, expand, exploit, and exterminate. So that's the rules of the game that you're talking about. One core conceit of civilization games is that the player is represented by an immortal character who exemplifies that civilization. Cleopatra for the Egyptians, Abraham Lincoln for the Americans, and so on. Yeah, exactly. So Australia was lucky enough to feature as a playable civilization in the latest game. And here we have the marquee character John Curtin, who's a socialist prime minister of Australia during World War I. Well, I mean, maybe, you know, he's important in the Australian Labor Party. Let's just put it like that. It's complicated. And Curtin played, yeah, so none of that really shows up in this kind of representation of him. But he does function importantly in World War I as part of this nationalist coming-of-age mythology. So if you've seen Peter Weir's film Gallipoli, that's that kind of like moment of, which is obviously why he was chosen. However, Australian history is older than World War I. Various techniques disagree on how exactly long Indigenous Australians have lived on the continent, but they range from 50,000 to 100,000, over 100,000 years. So orders of magnitude greater than what this represents. These sorts of games are often coded as simulations, inferring that they have some kind of simple relation of fidelity to real life. But as Thomas Apley has argued in his paper Virtual Un-Australias, each act of simulation is also an act of exclusion as well as inclusion. What's also apparent here is the environmental politics due to Australia's unique landscape, flora and fauna. There's little in Civilization 6 to indicate the contradictions of a giant desert in which people have decided to have a European appetite for water in the small kind of like urban bits. Human-created disasters such as the introduction of invasive species, salination of waterways, and others are subordinated to a generic pollution mechanic. And the talk of Lou's talk about, you know, that kind of how pollution crosses borders is very difficult to represent in these sorts of games. There's no possibility in Civilization 6, for example, for recreating the Great Emu War of 1932. Look it up, it's a real thing. The emus actually won that war. So what we want to like kind of explore here is how, this is an example of some of the politics that go into these ways that games think about environments and design the environment. And we've come up with 4 modes through which to describe how the mainstream game industry generally does that. And I'll move quite quickly through these. So the first mode is environment as backdrop. So you can see here, this is like a Super Mario Brothers level, and it's kind of been made into a GIF, so you can kind of like see like the whole level like kind of smooshed out. And as you can see, like Mario's latitude for movement is such that he can't possibly move into that backdrop. And the invention of like parallax movement so that the background is moving at a different rate from the foreground characters was a way of creating the illusion of depth in these 2D games. So part of the environment here is that it is by definition not kind of like interactable. Corey Archangel did a very famous kind of like work of art about this where he just took the clouds, so Super Mario clouds he called it. And that's that kind of like parallax movement, the background. It would be a mistake, we think, to think of this mode of representing the environment as simply like a technological limitation of a bygone kind of era. because if we look at these 3D kind of like games, sorry, that's just like someone's obviously put a seagull model into Grand Theft Auto 5, and like, this is revenge of the environment. So you can see that in the background, you can see that's what's called a skybox. So that's the kind of illusion of a kind of like receding horizon, but it's just kind of like a cloche that they put on top of the level. That's kind of like, that's a background to the, I should probably, yeah, I'll go back to this one for now. The other thing is like the background kind of like works in a strange way in the 3D games. In Grand Theft Auto, you can't actually, all these buildings are modeled, but like you can't actually go into very many of them at all. All the action in the game is on the streets. You're supposed to be driving around. It's a very realistically modeled city, but it's only surface. So the background is actually interior to, and this is very common in games, is interior to the models. There's no interiority to them. It's just pure surface. So the background's disappeared into plain view. And the other thing, which will lead into the next mode of environment, is there's hardly any refueling stations, petrol stations, like in these recreated cities. There's no need to refuel. You're just supposed to drive around. It's this kind of fantasy of efficient movement. And that leads us to the second mode, which is environment as resource. So what we have here, and this is actually, I won't talk about this, but this is actually like, they're trying to train a AI to play StarCraft, so that's kind of creepy in its own right. But leaving that aside, what you can see here is basically the mining process. So there's like two resources, one is rare, one is relatively abundant, and the game is predicated on you collecting these resources at a certain kind of a rate. And that's how they calibrate all of the activity that you get into in the game. All the units cost the same no matter what the situation is, so it's a very simplified economy that arises out of this kind of like activity. And there's another kind of like game like by Blizzard, which is World of Warcraft, and in that game you have things called mobs, which stands for mobile kind of entities, and they will generally respawn on a set timer. So this again, and generally an NPC will give you a quest to like go and kill 10 rats or something, and I don't know why he wants the rats, but like that again, like this environment as a resource that you can mine indefinitely. Things will respawn, they'll never actually kind of like run out. You just need to wait a bit longer. And the third mode is environment as antagonist. So as you can kind of see here, this is a game that's quite famous for being extremely difficult, called Dark Souls. And the environment here is basically kind of like created as this horrible antagonist. As you can kind of, yeah, this is all, you know, the horrible fate that awaits you if you play this game, which is part of the pleasure that people kind of like get out of it. And that kind of like mode of an antagonist, the environment is something that's out to kill you. The survival genre of games like gets into this quite a lot, but also the behavior of NPCs can be quite complicated. A lot of the times in this game, the StarCraft game, characters won't seek cover. They'll just stand there shooting at each other, and they won't display any kind of like retreat kind of behavior. So that kind of like is also sort of like a restricted understanding of environmental conditions that they're in. And finally, the last mode is environment as text. So here we have like the idea, everyone's probably heard of Minecraft, the idea of a game as something that's readable and generative. So something that you can kind of like transform. And Minecraft has a grammar, and you build things out of that kind of a grammar. So we kind of see this as one of the more positive ones, and people have done a lot of amazing things with that particular game. So, and Carl Bohaneke calls it eco-composition. So you're taking these kinds of like things and like transforming them. So I'll just move along quite rapidly. So while such a brief review can only be representative and not exhaustive, the idea of the 4 environmental models does offer a conceptual approach to the problem of climate change in games. And we're offering this as a heuristic and not a typology. So it's a way of understanding and not this kind of like just watertight boxes. Furthermore, this gives us a way of thinking about why there aren't more mainstream cli-fi games. In all four of these design modes, the environment is largely subject to the activity of more lively entities that happen to inhabit it, either an index of their movement as a background, subject to their extractive activities as a resource, a militarist kind of like trained to be conquered as antagonist, or a cognitive resource as a text. As we know, however, in the form of climate change, our environment is anything but a neutral mediator of action. It is more a box in which things occur. So how are we to conceptualize this broadening of the climate problem and how it could appear in games? At the outset, it should be noted that the preponderance of post-apocalyptic or dystopian scenarios behind climate change tropes and imagery also holds in games. Worlds are always getting destroyed in video games. Innumerable space marines and fantasy heroes have quested to deal with some perilous meteorological entity or world-threatening unintended consequence of technology. But we argue that these game plots tend to misrecognize or displace the anthropogenic element of climate change onto otherworldly or far future actors. We seek to preserve the anthropogenesis by incorporating work that crucially rethinks the nature-culture dichotomy. So one such work here is by the London-based artists Gibbs and Martelli, drawing on the story of a doomed Arctic explorer. It's an installation that uses the VR kind of technology and combines textual and photographic analysis, height map data, and VR technology to present an Arctic environment as a kind of digital sublime. So as you can see there, you're kind of like using pulleys to actually move the viewpoint around rather than this kind of like control scheme. And there's fans as well, which give you a kind of tactile sensation in addition. So incorporating these tactile elements such as fans and a rope attached to an accelerometer, it presents the environment and the fetishized first-person view not as static, but as suffused with loss and temporality. As with Jordan's approach to climate fiction, once we broaden our concern beyond a narrow focus on games thematically or narrative about climate change, through those four modes we can see that a lot of games actually do engage with environmental relations. At the same time, the exigencies of production and consumption mean that these relations are imagined and built for the benefit of this figure of the player, a figure characterized by consumerist egocentrism. This egocentric figure remains relatively constant across the various game designs and is for the benefit of this subjectivity that environments are constructed as background, resource, antagonist, or text. This is a source of the conceptual inertia that makes cli-fi so rare in mainstream video games. Okay, I might skip forward a little bit. So the modes of human environmental activity outlined above paint a rough picture of the space that artists and activists working with interactive games inevitably need to navigate and subvert. As we've shown in our review of the existing modes of engagement in climate games, activists and advocates wishing to use games face a difficult task. They risk falling into the same dynamic as the didactic or serious games genre, which largely do not succeed at having the widespread transformative effects that they aim for. Using our heuristic, it's possible to break down a particular climate change game design in terms of what elements serve in which mode and how they relate to player activity. It could be argued, for example, that not enough climate change games are climate justice games. In assuming a unified human agency that acts to affect change, do many such games push aside questions of uneven development and environmental impact and effectively relegate large swathes of humanity to being environment as background? I'll move quickly through some of the games that we've got here. So this one here in that corner is called Katamari Damacy, and it's kind of like basically you're a tiny, tiny little being, and you're rolling up this kind of like objects in the world to create ever bigger and larger and larger and larger spheres. The one here is called Eukerspiel by Daniel Kanaga, I think. And it's basically a dog opera, he's called it. And it's, again, this kind of like revealing these kind of like secret links between beings that are kind of like escaping these four environmental modes. Something like what Darius Kazemi has called a flat ontology. So I'll just move to the conclusion. So these sorts of games reveal a mutuality between beings that exceeds their conceptualization as background, resource, antagonist, or text, creating worlds in which both egocentric player viewpoint and subject-object relations are radically opened. In this way, they can be seen as a contemporary equivalent of Walter Benjamin's reading of the animation cinema of its own time. With its eccentric characters and talking animals, the globe-spanning Mickey Mouse is an image that, quote, radically challenges anthropocentric hierarchies, end quote. To extend Benjamin's thought, perhaps the salient question is less, where is the cli-fi literature of video games, and more, what can cli-fi of all kinds learn from gaming's most interesting experiments with form? We began this piece with a discussion of the emerging trend within contemporary literary fiction that has been labelled cli-fi, climate fiction set in the almost present as a response to the increasingly obvious and in-your-face nature of climate change. Given the size and scope of the contemporary digital games industry, we wondered, where are the cli-fi games? Finding very few within the mainstream. If cli-fi literature is an example of a growing awareness and concern over climate change, as well as an argument for its increasing cultural centrality, then a missing cli-fi trend in digital games is indeed something of an indictment of the medium's relevance. But if games in their distinctiveness and peculiarity instead have other more productive potential modes of engagement with the underlying causes of climate change, beyond the four modes sketched out here, then perhaps they will be poised to make a unique contribution after all to addressing what Amitav Ghosh has called the great derangement. Humans of the future will surely understand that only in one very brief era did a significant number of their kind believe that planets and asteroids are inert. Thanks.
Thank you very much. The final talk of the day is, as far as I know, not really centered around climate change. But I'm really happy to have a spatial practitioner as part of this lineup in Mitch McEwen. McEwen is a principal of McEwen Studio and co-founder of An Office, a collaborative design studio in Detroit and New York City. Since 2017, she has been an assistant professor at Princeton School of Architecture, and I will, if there's anything else I left out. It's good.
Great, thank you. Okay. Oh, yeah, right. We clap before anyone does anything. It's so nice. All right, everyone's so nice and patient here. I'm used to architecture events, where everyone's competitive with each other and kind of snarky about each other's slides in the back, So this is great. I want to come here all the time. Okay, so I'm going to talk about reparations and speculating, and hopefully it'll pick up on some things that because it's been exciting to hear other people, and I think one of the questions that stuck with me is how can we make that speculative dimension work for us in a different kind of way? And I'm sorry, I don't know who said it. It was someone on the earlier panel. So that's what I'm going to talk about. Reparations, obviously, folks have been, Ta-Nehisi Coates wrote an amazing piece for The Atlantic a few years ago that I think got reparations into a broader conversation. Also, I had the very good, I was lucky enough to be roommates with Sharifa Rhodes Pitts in college, who's been writing about Black utopias in her work, Harlem is Nowhere, and the kind of cataloging of the politics on the ground has been inspiring me. But also, it's important to note that in terms of working on urbanism and space, that there have been folks like W.B. Du Bois doing work that is already speculative on the page. I mean, these kind of drawings that were just recently, kind of archived digitally, which makes them more open, are these kind of diagrams that I think when you're looking at the rural population and it kind of spirals like that, then the drawing's already speculating, right? The drawing's already doing that work of asking you, what about the potential energy there where Black America in the South wants to be a kind of spring, right? Kind of popping off the Z dimension on the page there. And so, and then thinking about, this is this kind of like dramatic shift of freedom in the 19th century, and that's a kind of speculation in real life. So I want to connect that to some of the questions that were asked today, in terms of what would the mutant do. I think a Du Bois speculative diagram like this already asks, what would the mutant do? Rethinking the past in a new framework, right? I think that's work that happens, that we do in different activist moments, but that architecture also participates in. And that's a tricky thing to say in this country. Modernism as an architectural movement really came from working with socialists, planners and architects working with socialists, right? And so I think when we talk about the 21st century and the work that architecture needs to be doing in technology, we're talking about architects working with activists, working with the kind of thinkers who are in this room in a way before the answer of what's the building, what's the site, and what's the money comes together. And one of the thinkers that I like to rely on to do that architecturally is Lefebvre. Lefebvre talks about how space is already social, how there's no difference between something like a mathematical space, a scientific space, and a social space. That once we're in the mode of space, then that means that things are already flowing, and it means it's already societal and social. And I like to work in a way, I mean, this is not even a drawing, this is just kind of like when you open up a computer and you start working on drawings, the way that a line emerges, that how a line operates is already computational. We call computers, we don't call them geometers. There's a lot of things that computers are designed to do that are already within the realm of accounting and things like that, that they're very good at adding things up. They're actually not that good at working with geometry. And I'm actually glad about that, because it opens up ways of working kind of against the logic of accounting and tables and things like that, which I think it relates to some of the conversations that we've heard. So today what I'm going to do, this was just a kind of a quick introduction in terms of like what architects do in the 21st century, how I think about that. This is one of the places that I work on campus. These are some of my students working with robots. I voted against the robot doing the bath because I'm working on, building a chair and walls with robots, but I would not trust these robots to bathe anybody. And that could be a whole different talk about why that is. So what I'm going to do with these 10 minutes that I have really is talk about 3 projects. One is really kind of a research project that I call Watercraft. The second one is a speculation that's a collaboration with municipal geospatial data that I call Methexis. And then the third one, we'll just see what it is. I'm blanking on what it is right now. Okay, so this is the moment when Flint switched. They hit the switch, and they decided that they would, the folks in this room who are not democratically elected, would poison the people of Flint. And they're celebrating because it wasn't something to hide at the time, right? So I wanted to this research project, Watercraft. I was living in Michigan, and I was really wanting to understand how is it that could happen, but also how could that be connected to what was happening on the ground in Detroit, where people were getting their water shut off. And what does that mean spatially, and what does that open up as a way of working spatially against those kind of things, against that celebration of turning the switch? And what I started to locate was this vast kind of early smart city that started in the 1960s, that's underground and has a lot of different water pumps involved. And this early imagination of Michigan as this water wonderland in the middle of the Great Lakes, and that it was meeting a reality on the ground where people were protesting and reaching out to the UN about getting evicted from their houses because their water bills were too high. And what I started to locate was that there's this story that hasn't been told in the same way that the story of highways has been told, where highways, if we know anything about the suburbs and white flight and how it leads to fossil fuels, kind of addiction, that the highways were a vehicle, a kind of mechanism, a kind of technology that enabled white flight. Well, sewer lines also were, right? And so what that means is that here you have in 1966, George Ramus is this figure in municipal water in Michigan. He's basically the Robert Moses of water. What he started to set up in the 1960s is a system that delivers water and takes sewage from over 3 million people, and no one knows his name. So, you know, the population around Detroit kept climbing, right? So we're talking about 3 million people, and all the sewage is processed in this one place in Detroit. So until Mexico City is building a giant sewer plant right now, and there's one in Saudi Arabia, but other than those two, this was the largest sewage processing facility in the world until just recently. This is where I'm kind of hacking the municipal data a little bit in this watercraft project to start to look at, can we even see the lines of kind of subsidy where this Detroit resource is actually enabling not just the white flight, but the wealth of these McMansions and the kind of security of not having sewage flow up in the basement, which I will actually show you a little bit. And so what that means for folks on the ground in Detroit is not just water evictions, but also CSO, right? So climate change doesn't hit everybody the same way. So now when it rains, the Belle Isle and these beautiful waters around Detroit have combined sewer overflow issues. This is me kind of repurposing. I have to give credit to the Canadian government who set up a basic drawing so that I could understand what's there and then redraw it specifically for Detroit. But for the suburban area, the infrastructure basically works like this, where there's a sewer main and then there's a storm sewer, right? And so even if it's raining a lot, the storm sewer will catch that water, and the sanitary sewer doesn't flood the suburban basements. In Detroit, you have the one combined sewer, and so you get a lot of issues in addition to the combined sewer overflow. I'm working on a waterfront site right now in East Detroit. We're regularly, this is basically, I'm trying to draw what's happening in this neighborhood where people have sewage come up into their basements. And it's not their sewage. It's literally white people's shit. Okay. So how do you deal with that? How do you deal with white people's shit? I think that's a question of reparations. I'm going to show you more. Oh, that's what we end with, sorry, is the speculative reparations, a collaborative workshop that I did in Pittsburgh. But so just looking at basements themselves can be repurposed. They can become nodes that start to, especially when not all the houses are occupied as houses. Also, just in terms of design strategy, working in a broad field, this is a studio that I taught at Michigan where each student used algorithms to design not one house, but 99 houses, and they listen to Jay-Z a lot. But kind of zooming into a map like this, this is the methexis, where it's a collaborative kind of script that I'm still working on that takes municipal data and then speculates on what exists. And I think that's part of the work that needs to be done, is speculating on what's already happening. And I mean that because I take seriously what was said, that facts won't save us. But I think there's so many things happening that are so bizarre, right, that we need a speculative dimension to even face what exists. So this is a set of algorithms that takes those footprints and speculates on what's already there, both in terms of what might be not there, in terms of the kind of typical building systems of certain time periods, but also looking already at these voids that might do some of that water catchment I was talking about in basements, and purposely be kind of fuzzy in their logic, that the speculativeness can team up with a kind of fuzzy logic. So this was the first exhibition of methexis in Detroit. And obviously virtual reality is there. I think at the time this was hooking into another exhibit, but what this got me interested in was putting that kind of, that adjacency of speculating on what exists next to speculating on what might be. Right, so then what I'm going to close with is speculating on what might be. This moves to Pittsburgh, but where I'm interested in collapsing these things together and thinking across places, because I think we share so many issues. So in Pittsburgh, this was a workshop that I did called "This is what we will build when we get our reparations," and this was at the Asylum. Society of Asylum. It's a place where a few dozen people from Pittsburgh showed up to think about this together, what we will build when we get our reparations. And I like to think of this, that this can be a continuation of rethinking the past in the new framework. I think also related to the talk about video games, right? That the environment as a backdrop, I would say actually that can be a little bit how the environment plays out in terms of our political rhetoric, where the environment becomes a kind of backdrop or a kind of antagonist, maybe, right? There's a fossil environment that's an antagonist, or then there's an existing environment that's a backdrop. How do we make the environment part of the terms that we're speculating in? So here, this workshop took the kind of conventional terms of a charrette, like one of these sort of cheesy, you got your scissors and paper and kind of make your neighborhood different. But instead of just focusing on a kind of provincial idea of a neighborhood, we started with questions that were really asking about, okay, we have reparations, what are we going to do in terms of health? What is that going to mean in terms of what's really going to change in terms of employment? And people had these really big ideas, and I'm still working on drawing them together. But I realized that there was a scale shift, and so I then kind of remixed the collages together. And just to walk you through, I'm going to close walking you through just what's happening here. One is a kind of employment training area. Another is Center for Queer People of Color that also is doing some work around waterways in Pittsburgh and something about this kind of bridge that circles on itself. And then the one I'm going to show you is dealing with, instead of talking about gentrification, talking about kind of nestling in hills that are threatened by this kind of class conflict. And so this kind of nestling in these hills, I'm now thinking of them in relationship to the water in those basements, but really that it becomes a kind of provocation of thinking of, if we do have the wealth and the resources to continue to occupy the spaces where we've been telling our stories, then how does that change the environment around us and the rules, the basic rules between something like building and a hill, between interior and ground? All right, thank you.
Thank you so much, Mitch, and thank you to all of the panelists. We now will have some time for discussion and questions, and I'm gonna.
Oh, it's 15 minutes. Do we take questions? Is that what happens?
Mm-hmm. Anyone have a question?
I do. This is probably for Lou and for Mitch. Just thinking of speculating on what already exists and stories that are wilder and deeper than we knew were there. Like, I didn't know anything about this history of the travel of the actual material that produced Little Boy and the other munitions. That's just feeling very powerful, and I want to hear you say more about that, both of you, either speculating, how do you find these things that exist that are ignored and sort of excavate them, and also, is there an actual set of practical ways to frame how do we find these things that already exist?
Well, I've heard that story, which was also, new to me, about the Dene traveling from a play. And I think that there are ways in which, literature, arts can often tackle these kinds of unwieldy histories that don't sort of fit into political narratives easily. But I also say that as somebody who's a literature student, so that has been where I turn. But yeah, I don't know. I'm curious to see what you would say, Mitch.
I think we all have access to how weird and violent and weirdly hypocritical so many things are, right? And I think that one of the ways that architecture opens up, ways of dealing in a speculative way with what exists is by not foreclosing what. So it's hard sometimes to register something that is really difficult if you don't know how to solve it, right? And so it can seem like until you know how to solve it, you don't even want to address that this really weird thing that doesn't need to be happening is happening, right? And I think that something we've been talking about today in literature that I think architecture also does is open up ways of drawing and demarcating both what's happening and what might happen before you know how it's actually going to really happen. And that is something that the speculative dimension of architecture it's, when you're talking about real estate and making buildings, most architects are not involved in most buildings, So that's something that I think architecture and literature actually share, is opening up a way to think through alternatives without knowing where that's going to take you, what the end of it is.
Thanks, you guys. That was great. So mining, climate change, and water, like 3 of my favorite topics. And we're speculating about possible futures. And in April in Michigan, Nestle was given water rights.
Yeah, that's what it was all about.
Electricity is necessary for video games. Sustainable power sources are relying on lithium mining, which is incredibly environmentally invasive. So the environmental injustice that we have seen happen over the last 100 years is happening again in the context of sustainable energy sources. How does that become visible?
Well, I mean, it struck me hearing about the video games, the resource antagonist and backdrop. It's still the settler's idea of what nature is, right? So I feel like there's a lot of work to be done to dig out the kind of pastoral ideas of what nature is, from our rhetoric, both in terms of language, but also visual, and especially how the built environment is negotiated. When Flint, the whole kind of plan, other than emergency management, was all about blue water, what do they call it? Blue economy. Blue economy is the kind of euphemism for making money off of the water that fracking requires, or this kind of privatization. I guess I also wanted to pick up on what you were saying about shame, because there's a way in which it can like that kind of self-policing that you were talking about, that there's a way that I think that the certain ideas of nature is really innocent in all of that. When we encounter ways that these environments are not innocent or pure, that somehow we need to keep working on the freedom to negotiate that without feeling, without self-policing, really. I think there's a lot of kind of self-censorship and self-policing in how we even negotiate the environment.
I think with regards to, so I would say that is a critique of the way that the games operate at the moment. So for example, if you had in Civilization, if you were playing the Congo, the DRC for example, and you happen to have all that coltan, that would be a good thing. It would accrue to your nation, as a player. And this is why we're critiquing egocentrism, because as a player, you have to be able to win, and that drives the logic of the game. Whereas, as we know, none of that coltan is really, in fact, it's horrible for that nation that resource is located there. It's been really, really bad in many ways. So that is a dynamic that's rarely captured if you have this kind of viewpoint that drives these kinds of designs.
Other questions? It's for the live stream.
I will keep my question to the comment section. I don't want to be live on the internet right now.
If you say without the mic in your ear, they can't hear you.
So, Priscilla, it's a compliment. I think it's, you lied to me, right? I thought you can. So I think it's fascinating that all of you on this panel, and I see additional threads that connect your work that maybe haven't been vocalized. And to Dylan, I've lived in Detroit for a long time working on managerial racism at about the same time. And I've interviewed Andy Dylan at length. And you want to guess what his next emergency management economy was before the disaster?
He's doing bankruptcy.
Puerto Rico. He went to Puerto Rico. It's almost like the emergency management precedes every disaster, in which we end up much like Flynn preceded, like the emergency management preceded Flynn water. And so I think I'm really optimistic about being here, because I feel like we'll find
You're the heuristic guy with the typology.
It's really hard.
It's almost like the schizophrenic seeing connections, but there aren't, but there are, except they're very complex. It's not just paranoid theories. What kind of organizing principles can we have for this outside of being schizophrenic?
Well, I mean, yeah, I think like the problem of like visualizing these really complex systems is something that's run throughout the entire kind of like, discussion across all the panels. And, there's games can do that in a certain way. They are a kind of data visualization. And that's why thinking through what's limited from them from going in that direction is kind of interesting. But also like something as complex as water systems or how pollution propagates over national borders and why the legal system can't do anything about that really is, that it's an interesting kind of like, how do we visualize this stuff? So maybe data visualization will be really interesting to see where it goes,
I mean, those amazing drawings that you were showing with your essay, I saw the byline that Ingrid drew them, right? And this is answering your question, but in a roundabout way, that I was admiring those drawings and how they dealt with so much complex information, but without being fetishistic about their complexity, and without also having this kind of twist on them that had so much style that said, oh, this is so me, I always use this color pink or something, right? And so there was an ethos in those drawings that I can recognize and be like, oh, I wish I did those. Who is that person who did those? Oh, it's Ingrid and she already invited me here. That's great, So, but I wouldn't be the person who could like make those into principles. I just recognize it when I see it. So I think you, just from what I've already heard you talk about, sound like a person who could put those principles down and put them in multiple languages and make them clear to a lot of people. All I would say is bring architects into the room because we can make the drawings.
We can also emphasize shadow space, which literature sometimes can.
I don't know if I have like snappy principles, but I think one of the things that I was trying to think through in this essay, and that was both prompted by the Dene trip to Hiroshima, but also the radioactive monitoring project, are like groups of people who are willing to make connections across like breaks or like make unexpected relationships where those relationships have been like forcefully foreclosed. And I think that that's something that is true across most political struggles, is that it's about finding ways to connect resources or even just like connect some sort of source of amplification so that people, or whether they're speaking or acting, it can have a greater effect over a greater space or across time. So it's really, it's about looking for, like I said, like the connections, but also like where are there productive ruptures, where like even if you do have very sort of different liberatory ends, there's still a way in which those can like coexist and amplify each other.
Any other comment or question?
Well, extremely nice here. Just one architect. That's how you keep it nice. Just one. I'm supposed to, I guess, have like closing remarks, which I was like, I'll just let the day kind of help me shape that. That didn't really work because I'm now just like overwhelmed with all of the great things that I heard. I don't know. I guess, so the name of this conference is mostly arbitrarily driven by the fact that somehow there wasn't already an event named this. There's like a design studio named Future Perfect. That's about it. So I was like, because like every good future phrase was already like taken. But I kind of like it because there's like a verb tense, like Future Perfect is like that state of like assuming like that this thing has already happened, therefore then all these other things will happen, right? Like it's the verb tense of like in the future, assume like these certain facts are given, and like what that also means is certain other facts are like foreclosed. And what I found really what's wonderful about this, these conversations has been recognizing the ways in which, yeah, like we can accept and look hard at certain futures that have been foreclosed or that have been presumed kind of like impossible or that are kind of unescapable in some ways now. And that in some ways like we're learning to live with. But also, this was a really wonderful day for thinking through kind of like, what are the assumptions of like assumptions about the future that could be made differently, that could be kind of projected differently if we assume certain other givens could happen instead. And I'm really excited to continue to follow all of your work and see what kind of futures we can all build. So thank you so much for being part of this.